Hello and welcome to Brighton. We're live at the Liberal Democrat conference for the party's first get-together since the election. The sun is shining over the sea in front of me and everyone here is feeling upbeat.
This country, our parliament, needs a party that has credibility on the economy, credibility on health and care. We're that party, and with 72 MPs, we will get our voice heard.
Lib Dem leader Ed Davey is riding high after winning a record number of seats in July's general election. This morning, he has been warming up for his conference speech, promising a new type of politics.
What I want for the Liberal Democrats in this parliament is to be the best opposition. I think we can be a much better opposition than the Conservatives, who are pretty divided.
We'll also be hearing from 3 Liberal Democrat Party members, and there have been calls for the leadership to be bolder.
We know that most of the country thinks that we regret the Brexit decision. It has been really disappointing.
We'll look ahead to Ed Davey's speech and discuss how the party plans to use its increased presence in Parliament. With me here in Brighton are Christopher Hope, political editor and presenter with GB News, the Liberal Democrat education spokesperson Munira Wilson, and deputy opinion editor at the Financial Times, Miranda Green. This is Politics Live in Brighton. Welcome. Well, the weather is certainly matching the mood here in Brighton at this Liberal Democrat conference, and no wonder they've got a record number of MPs since the general election in July. It's buzzing here at the exhibition floor. You can see all the stalls behind me and all the sort of buzz of people milling about, obviously waiting for that big speech from Sir Ed Davey, the party's leader, this afternoon. It'll be at around 2:30, and of course we'll have another Politics Live special programme from 2:15 to cover it. Let's have a look inside the conference hall, where speakers have been taking to the stage and addressing delegates all morning. They are, of course, the warm-up act for the big leader's speech this afternoon. But let's turn to our guests and start off just broadly. Munira, how does it feel?
Oh, it's electric, buzzing, as you said. It's a fantastic celebration of having had a record historic result at the general election. 72 MPs, the largest third party in Parliament in a century. So we're all very much on a high, but also talking about serious issues and how we're going to take them forward and be a constructive opposition to Labour going forward.
Well, we'll talk about what that really means, being a constructive opposition. Miranda, you are a seasoned, let's put it that way, Lib Dem watcher, and of course worked for the party. Put it into a little bit of context for us in terms of this record number. It's been a while.
It has been a while. I mean, back in 1997, which was the last time that the Lib Dems kind of really had a significant increase on their numbers off the back of the electorate rejecting a Conservative government, there was a similar sort of atmosphere of celebration. But of course, those are really difficult circumstances in terms of, different circumstances, I should say, in terms of relations with Labour, because Labour and the Lib Dems, Ashdown and Blair, were very close. It's really different now. So the question for the party is, what do you make of it? It's an amazing opportunity. Potentially, the Tory party, if they make the wrong choice of leader, could fall even further. Maybe this isn't the high watermark for the Lib Dems. There's a lot of chat about that. But also, how does the party actually relate to the 2 other main parties? Do they kind of tack a bit to the centre-right, a bit more to the centre-left? Where's the opportunity? So there's a bit of chat about them, that in amongst what is actually a very celebratory mood here, has to be said.
At the moment, of course, the Liberal Democrats do have an opportunity to sort of fill the vacuum that is being left politically at the moment, while the Conservatives have their leadership contest.
For another 6 or 7 weeks.
Yeah.
For me, it's all about the difficult second album. They've done really well, the Lib Dems, in that July 4th election, but how do they win big again and improve on that in 2028, 2029, 60 seats, I think it is, they've won off the Tory party. They're second in 20 against the Tory party. They can really push on and be that party of opposition. But how will politics change, I think? You know, you're going to have 3 chaired select committees by Lib Dems. And that's interesting in itself. What will that mean? Absolutely. What will they be looking at that we wouldn't look at previously?
I think what's really interesting about this actually is the wider kind of political tumult. You know, we had so many years when politics was really sclerotic, and then in a short period, it seems all to play for. And for a third party to even be talking about 72 as not the high watermark, there are only 50 seats behind the Tory party. The House of Commons opposition benches look really different now. Could that evolve even further?
Well, as we have all said, what a difference a general election makes. Let's have a look back at the campaign.
We need to transform our politics. Our politics is broken.
Oh gosh, we're going to keep going, right, okay.
Okay, you ready?
To the other numbers, the Liberal Democrats up 53 on 61 seats.
Well, Sir Ed Davey clearly enjoying himself during that campaign. The majority of the seats were won from what your leader calls the blue wall, or the former blue wall, former Conservative seats. And he's continuing a pledge to demolish it even further. Is that the right strategy?
Well, under a first-past and post-electoral system, you go for the seats that where you're strongest and where you have the best chance of winning. And as Chris has already pointed out, we're second place to the Conservatives in a whole swathe of seats, and it makes absolute sense that that's where we continue to build and grow our presence. It doesn't mean we don't fight Labour. You need to just look at local councils in different parts of the country, Hull, Sunderland, Liverpool, where we are actually fighting Labour at a local level and growing that local government base too.
Right, but interestingly and arguably, everything you do and say when it comes to the economy is to the left of the Labour Party, and yet so many of the seats where you have been successful, there are swathes of constituents there who won't agree with that.
Well, I really challenge that premise of left-right politics. I think when you see how the electorate has fractured over recent years, I think that sort of left-right way of thinking is a bit. I think we've moved on from that, and I'm a Liberal Democrat. We're putting forward liberal policies. We're looking at where we can raise taxes fairly to invest in our economy, but invest in public services so that we can grow the economy. And that's where we're not hearing things from the Labour Party, and certainly nothing from the Conservatives.
Right, well, we'll talk about your sort of left-right distinction, because on economics, it looks like a classic left-wing programme. Is that going to go down well in some of those former Conservative areas, the leafy suburbs?
Yeah, I've been speaking to them last night. I interviewed Ed Davey last night for GB News and asked him, is immigration a far-right issue? He said it's not. You know, so he's trying to reach into that the elements of those former Tory voters saying we can offer you something here. I also said, would you campaign with Nigel Farage for electoral reform, which is your party's policy? He said no. So that he'll go so far, but not too far, I think.
Well, we're still committed to electoral reform. I mean, I don't share any values with Nigel Farage. If he wants to campaign for it,
you want PR, don't you?
Yeah, but that's fairer votes. It's a policy issue.
Oh, right.
It's not a value. It's not a value. It's a process. But sorry, just to come back to your other point, if 57 constituencies, I think one of them was from the SNP, but 57 constituencies were won from the Tories on our manifesto with the tax policies you talk about. So clearly, it did resonate with Conservative-leaning voters in the past. They feel abandoned. They want decent public services.
Yes.
They could see that we wanted to invest in our health and care service and clean up our rivers and seas. And we put forward a whole set of policies to make sure that we can start to fix them.
Tories will not be as bad as they were this time. Next time.
We don't know.
I reckon they were. People were so cross with them.
Well,
you got lucky. You got lucky, Lib Dem.
Well, hang on. On that issue, Miranda, are people voting for the Liberal Democrats to punish the Conservatives? They did so in this election, rather than for the policies that Munira says, yes, they were clearly stated in the manifesto. Dare I say, a lot of voters don't always read the manifestos. I mean, the More in Common poll for the Eye found 43% of Lib Dem voters say they would have voted differently for another party if they thought they would have won their seat. You can't rely on that anti-Tory vote.
Oh, yeah, totally. But the challenge for Ed Davey now is to convince people that having been lent those votes, and they are lent, that you continue to campaign on the things that you promised in the election. And actually, you know what's really interesting about that? If you look at those blue wall seats, and I know this because we did really detailed polling for the FT during the campaign, the number one issue in those blue wall seats for former Tory voters was the NHS. So actually, the idea that it's all about taxing the economy, that's certainly in the top three, important issues. But actually, the whole electorate, we know, were really angry with the way that the Conservative government had left the public services. So part of it is to do with continuing those themes and the priorities of the people who let you in. You're quite right, though, and to an extent I agree with Chris. There is always a kind of strategic dilemma for the third party, but it's a lot of it dependent on how the other two parties behave. So will the government screw up and give you opportunities that you can attack them on? Will the as it was, main opposition party, the Tories, come back to sanity, or will they take the long way round, which gives you, further seats you can fight?
And the budget is going to be, after the party conferences, the next big political date in the calendar. And Ed Davey has said very clearly that in order to close the financial shortfall that Labour says they've inherited from the Conservatives, you've got to tax the banks, the billionaires, the tech giants, the water companies, the tobacco companies, the oil and gas companies, all of the bogeymen, and women possibly, in the corporate world. That'll go down well, won't it, with voters, Chris?
Well, which voters? I mean, many on the former Tory voters may not want that, and they fought the election, didn't they, with Lib Dems on increasing capital gains tax. But whether that level of tax burden going up may not be welcomed by those voters you've won.
When you're talking about the 0.1% wealthiest who pay capital gains tax, the vast majority of the electorate is not going to be touched by that reform.
Entrepreneurs don't like it.
And it would, yes, but there were various reliefs and things built into it. It's about reforming capital gains tax, and it was the 0.1% top payers of capital gains tax who'd be affected. The vast majority of the country, those with smaller shareholdings and indeed with reliefs for entrepreneurs, because we are also the party of business and enterprise, we want to support small and medium-sized businesses as well, they wouldn't be affected by it. And yes, Jo, to your point, I recognise that people don't read manifestos, but we were putting these things on our leaflets day in, day out, and talking to people on the doorstep. When people say, yes, I do want more GPs, how are you going to pay for it? We had the answer, whereas Labour and the Conservatives never, ever did.
Yeah, but Chris, this would raise, if the Liberal Democrats ever were able to put any of this into action, of course, they say around £27 billion that would go into public services like the NHS, which many voters would like to see.
Yes, that may be the case. I'm seeing differentials, though, I think, now with Labour with Lib Dems against Labour, in the way that you're saying that the fact that Starmer's only saying only money will go into the NHS with improvements in productivity, and you're saying that or even after, forgive me, and that is not, and that's a problem for Lib Dems at the moment.
I think they need to go hand in hand, because part of driving that productivity is around, say, investment in technology, and therefore you do need to spend some money to be able to bring the reforms in and improve productivity. It goes hand in hand.
At this point, I think we have to say goodbye to you, Chris Hope, but thank you for popping by. Enjoy the speech this afternoon. Now, a little earlier, I caught up with 3 Liberal Democrat members. I'm down on the beach in Brighton, making the most of the glorious sunshine here for the Liberal Democrat Party conference. Here with me are 3 party members. We have Marianne Gilbert, Peter Black and Catherine Ewing. Welcome to all of you. First of all, Peter, starting with you. Ed Davey's going to make his speech this afternoon, and he's going to stress that the strategy and the focus is to demolish the rest of the blue wall, former Conservative seats. Is that the right strategy?
Well, clearly it's a strategy he wants to follow, and I don't disagree with that. But I'm based in Swansea, in strong Labour territory, and I think we are going to have to recognise that there's only so many Tory seats left that we can win. We have to consolidate what we've gained, but we also have to start looking at the Labour seats and looking at how we can replace them in some of those seats. And I certainly hope that we can have a strategy which is going to deal with those Labour seats as well.
Maybe part of the strategy in terms of facing and challenging Labour, Catherine, would be about promoting more on the environment, which is very much your passion.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Labour just don't have the strength on the environment. They've set up GB Energy, and maybe that's exciting, but their nature policy is just not strong enough. It's not like ours.
So what should the Liberal Democrats be doing? We don't hear that much about the environment and the sorts of policies you were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. We want to see it pushed higher up the agenda. We already care a lot about sewage and clean water, so obviously we do care about the environment, but the Green Lib Dems would like to see a greater focus on really green economics, maybe push the donut economic model for sustainable development, just transition. We would like to see no new oil and gas, absolutely committed in the manifesto. We're already there. Our policy agrees with that, it aligns with that, so we'd like to see that.
Marianne, what about just being here with 72 Liberal Democrat MPs? It is a record, historically, really. I think it was 100 years ago when those sorts of numbers were in Parliament.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a fantastic success, and the campaign team have done a huge job, and it's really something to celebrate. And what I want to look at next is where we go on from here. I'm from the East Midlands, where we don't have a single MP. So you keep hearing, isn't it good? You know, we've got 72. But what we want to do next is find a way of making the Liberal Democrats more national, to fill in some of these north and east areas where really not a lot happens.
What sort of things would the party have to do in order to change that situation in the East Midlands?
What I think it ought to do next is look at seats where Lib Dems came second, and really put some of the effort that's gone into the target seats now into some of these seats in other areas where we have some hope, because really if the Lib Dems in future want to progress and become a national party, they've really got to cover the nation.
In terms of saving the NHS, which is what Ed Davey pledged during the campaign, and he'll no doubt underline that in the speech this afternoon, how?
Well, there needs to be more public investment. I mean, I live in Wales, where Labour's failed the NHS for the last 20 years. So, no, we're not expecting Labour to do great things. But if you don't put the investment into the NHS in terms of particularly the infrastructure, and get social care right as well, which Labour hasn't really managed to do, so that would help take the pressure off the NHS, take the pressure off hospitals, and enable them to sort themselves out.
But as the third party, how much influence can Liberal Democrats really have?
Well, you can have a lot of influence, because if you're pushing it at a door, a half-open door, which I think we are in terms of social care, then people will start to listen to you. And when you start talking, getting the country behind you as well, because a lot of people feel very strongly about social care, and that was evident in the campaign which we fought and the response to that campaign. So I think we're pushing it as an open door. It's just a question of pushing a bit harder and making Labour ministers sit up and listen, and in particular getting the Treasury to stump up the cash which is needed to sort this out.
We've got the budget, of course, on October the 30th, but one of the issues that perhaps hasn't been promoted as much as some members here would like is rejoining the single market, promoting the relationship with the EU. Are you disappointed?
Yeah, absolutely. It is a disappointment, and we should really be very strong on that. We know that most of the country thinks that we regret the Brexit decision. It has been really disappointing, so we should be thinking about that more again.
What message do you want to go away with from this conference?
Can I pick up something
Yes.
on Brexit? Yeah. Absolutely, that's where I want to be. We never wanted to come out of it, etc., etc. But I think we've got to be cautious, because I don't think Europe are ever so enamoured with us at the moment after the last few years. So I think we've got to go stepwise. I absolutely agree, but I think if we rushed at this, we could make a mess of it.
And we're going to talk about the Liberal Democrats' policy or not towards the EU. But let's welcome the BBC's political editor, Chris Mason, to our sunny stage here in Brighton. What have you noticed since being here, Chris?
Well, the obvious point is just jubilation wherever you look from Liberal Democrats. It's kind of impossible not to notice that. And I suppose, you know, why wouldn't you as a party lean into that after the election result that they've just had? On that point on Brexit, it's an intriguing one. A broader point that I'm struck by is that we had, didn't we, those years where we talked about nothing other than Brexit. And now we've had a couple of years where we've talked about anything other than Brexit. And I do wonder more broadly, for the Liberal Democrats in particular, but politics more widely, when we get to a sort of normalised point in the conversation about our relationship with the European Union, where of course there'll be passionate arguments on all sides, as you would expect, but it isn't either regarded as the topic that we should talk about all the time, or one that is almost like touching fire to argue either view or any range of views upon. And I think you get a sense of that there.
Absolutely, and it's interesting in a party that has been, and maybe still is, privately, the most sort of pro-Remain, pro-EU political party on the sort of mainstream. Yes, precisely. Saving the NHS, that's what Ed Davey pledged to do during the election, and he will no doubt say it again in his conference speech. How can 72 MPs save the NHS if it needs saving?
And again, this is the intriguing thing, isn't it? So alongside that understandable jubilation from Liberal Democrats, there is a bigger parliamentary question to ask, which is that given the current arithmetic, in other words, a Labour government with a Himalayan majority, can the Liberal Democrats be more influential in this Parliament than they were in the last? Now, numerically, of course, they are, 5 times bigger, more than that? So much bigger. But the last few parliaments have had governments that, at least numerically, have been much more vulnerable. And therefore, you could exact influence with a smaller number of MPs. So I think that is an interesting challenge. I mean, I guess from a Liberal Democrat perspective, it's a nice dilemma to have posed. How much influence can you exact? Because the honest answer in the last Parliament was kind of diddly squat. Really.
Well, but it is always about expectation and delivery. Let's have a listen to what Ed Davey said himself about his pledge.
Right now, there are thousands of people stuck in hospital beds well enough to be discharged, but unable to leave because the care they need at home or in a care home simply isn't there. After years of Conservative chaos and neglect, the scale of the challenge is enormous. So our manifesto doesn't shy away from that. We are putting forward a bold, ambitious and fully costed plan to tackle the health and care crisis from top to bottom. This is a manifesto to save the NHS.
But Munira, how are you going to deliver on any of that? You're the third party. You have 72 MPs. Labour, as we've just heard from Chris, have this mammoth majority. They'll do what they like.
So 72 MPs were elected on that manifesto that Ed was just talking about, which had health and care at the front and centre of it. So it is our job, day in, day out, to hold the Labour government to account.
How?
And in the Parliament by asking questions, scrutinising what they're bringing forward. We're now chairing the Health Committee as well, which is a really important and powerful tool for Liberal Democrats to hold the Health Secretary to account on what he is doing or not doing in the case of social care on both health and care. So we've been tasked to go and put forward these as our priorities, and we will hold Labour's feet to the fire. I just want to pick up a point that Chris made about us having diddly squat influence in the last Parliament. Yeah, we were only 15 and facing a Tory majority of 80, but you look at things like the sewage scandal and the fact that water is such a big political issue. Who started that campaign? Liberal Democrats. You look at the windfall tax, you look at the cap on energy prices. Who put forward those suggestions first? Yes, they were aped by Labour, and then the Conservatives watered them down, but it all came from the Liberal Democrats. And whereas before, people didn't really notice that because we didn't have the platform. Now we've got a much bigger platform to shout that from. And if we're streeting and Rachel Reeves starts stealing our ideas, we will be delighted to say, thank you very much. These were Liberal Democrat policies that we campaigned for, and our MPs have made you adopt them.
I suppose my thought would be to nuance it a little, was that I think you had a greater influence than your parliamentary numbers in the last Parliament, albeit your parliamentary numbers were tiny. The challenge now is, can you turn that 72 in a different parliamentary context, given the scale of Labour's victory, into an equivalent amount of influence?
Well, if we had a bigger influence as 15, think of 72 powerhouse MPs. I mean, Liberal Democrats are known to be hardworking both locally and in Parliament. I mean, we don't take it easy, and that's why I think, without sounding big-headed, I do think we punch above our weight, which is why perhaps we had a bigger influence.
But one of the things, Munira,
suggest.
that might hinder you is the report that we've just had from Arid Darzi, former Labour minister, and he did the report into the NHS. He says it's in a dire state, and you would broadly agree with that. But he went on to say that one of the key reasons why the NHS is in such a poor condition is because of the austerity years when you were in government with the Conservatives from 2010 to 2015. Do you accept that?
So on austerity, in terms of day-to-day spending on the NHS, between 2010 and 2015, we maintained day-to-day spending. A lot of the day-to-day spending
cuts came 1% per year increase in real terms.
After 2015 came most of the cuts, and that's when a lot of the targets are on waiting times for cancer and A&E admissions started to really be missed.
Well, actually, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, between 2010 and 2015, there was a 1%, only a 1% per year increase in real terms. When the Conservatives won their majority in 2015, it was 2.4% per year in real terms in 14-15, 24-25, taking out the COVID years, because obviously that was very different. Do you accept you were part of that austerity that starved the NHS of the sort of increases that they'd had previously?
Liberal Democrats were a junior partner in a coalition government fighting Tories every day. Okay, we won some battles and we didn't win other battles. But we've recognised that, and we paid a heavy price for that in 2015. We paid a heavy price for that, and now voters have put their trust in us again in record numbers, and we will keep campaigning on our promises.
Miranda, that is the issue, is the trust. And Ed Davies talked about it too. Trust, he believes, has been or is being restored. But people will remember those years. That report has reiterated it. And also the fact of a reorganisation that happened. Yes, it was a former Tory health minister.
Andrew Lansley,
that Arid Darzi said was also hugely damaging and from which we've never recovered in terms of the NHS.
And which was a sort of flashpoint at previous Lib Dem conferences, the Lansley reforms. And the party as a whole only came on side with it quite reluctantly, as I recall. I mean, I'm not sure that they quite yet have the best answer to the coalition years questions. And I thought that during the election campaign, and happily for Ed Davey, the questions kind of moved off that territory. I think a bit like the Brexit years, it's increasingly in the rear-view mirror. I mean, like Chris, I'm fascinated about this question as to how quickly politics can move beyond that Brexit divide and come back to the issues that are people's true priorities. I mean, I can remember Lib Dem conferences not that long ago where it was almost like being on one side of a kind of huge cultural cleave in the country between Leave and Remain. I think actually one of the good things that's happened to the Lib Dems in the last 2 or 3 years is getting back to where people's actual priorities are. You don't hear people talking about electoral reform endlessly.
They're not talking about down the pub, no.
No, indeed. And they're not, they are talking about sewage and the health service and the social care crisis, which actually is how you win a lot of seats with a diverse electorate. And that's part of the sort of strategic dilemma about left or right. It's actually finding out people's priorities. And some of that is having a better answer on the coalition years question. I do agree on that.
Well, that's something maybe to think about then, Munira, while we're having this discussion. But in terms of having priorities, yes, I think the priorities for many people are clear. But how to solve those issues is less clear. I mean, it's interesting that the Labour government has spent quite some time laying the foundations for saying, yes, we believe in our NHS, but no more money without reform. How difficult is that going to be for Liberal Democrats? I'll ask Munira in a moment, in terms of that equation.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we've heard, haven't we, Sir Ed Davey and others here argue that there needs to be alongside reform or change the extra money, and then there's the context of the budget coming next month, and then the kind of tough choices. And I think this is an intriguing dilemma for the Liberal Democrats around where you suggest that taxes might rise, particularly given the kind of constituencies that you now represent. I was talking to Ed Davey yesterday and put to him, that idea, that long-standing Lib Dem policy going back a little while now of the penny on income tax, and the argument at the time that was a clear offer to address, I think education was the focus at the time for how it would be spent. And now Sir Ed's argument is no, that doesn't work around cost of living pressures and all the rest of it, and so there's talk around capital gains tax and others. But how that argument is prosecuted, given the constituencies your party now represents, is just, I think, an intriguing one when a fair chunk of constituents of new Labour MPs might be those who disproportionately pick up the bill for some of these proposed tax changes.
Well, and talking of costs and prices to pay, let me just show you this BBC News headline. Junior doctors accept the 22% pay rise to end strikes. Presumably you support and back and welcome that, Munira. But how would you pay for it if it was your decision?
Look, what I do welcome is an end to strikes, and I think patients up and down the country welcome that, right? When I hear from constituents, or even my own mother, when she's waiting for an operation and worried that maybe it might get cancelled because of strikes, it's not a great place to be. So at least they got round the table and have got to an agreement. Look, I'm not party to the Treasury's accounts and what discussions were going on behind the scenes, whether this was a reasonable,
list of tax rises
reasonable level to settle at. So, but I'm just glad that we've actually finally got to an agreement where the Tories just failed to come to an agreement with anything, and that's one of the other things that was bringing this country to a halt and of public services to their knees.
Briefly,
I did have a really intriguing bit of gossip,
Oh,
which is that actually
maybe not so briefly.
the ministerial team in Labour for Health is quite delighted that the Lib Dems are now chairing the Health Select Committee, because actually it gives them a bit of political cover to ask for more money, because the NHS needs more money. So there we are.
So there's no difference between you and the Labour government then when it comes to health. You won't be holding their feet to the fire, will
Well, no,
you?
they
They've
will.
said nothing on social care,
thereby
and
allowing Wes Streeting to ask for more from Rachel Reeves, right?
The distinction between the Department of Health and the Treasury.
Well, that's
and we've heard the same
ever
rumour.
that there are always those rows
But
for more money.
critically, we've heard nothing from Labour on social care, and you can't fix the NHS without starting to sort out social care, and that is an area we will keep banging that drum again and again and again.
But which in Scotland, the first Lib Lab coalition in Scotland, fixed the social care problem on day one. But there's no national Lib Lab coalition cooperation anymore, which is actually possibly part of the problem.
Chris Mason, I think we have to let you go. Thank you very much for joining us here in our makeshift, but glamorous, I hope, studio. And, of course, we'll see you later on when we are covering Ed Davies' speech. Chris Mason will join us again, either before or after or both. I can't quite remember, but he'll be here for part of it. And that will kick off the programme at 2:15 and the speech around 2:30. But we know, as always, in traditionally, timings are always flexible. Now, we touched on the issue of the UK's relationship with the EU and the sort of post-Brexit trauma that some people here really felt. But there are divisions here, indeed, over that decision that was taken. Let's talk to a former MEP, a former member of the European Parliament, and who is from the Liberal Democrat European Group, Phil Bennion. He is here, and ask him how he feels the Liberal Democrat Party, have they got it right in terms of their approach to our relationship with the EU?
Yes, I think we have got it right.
Hello, Phil. Can you...
yes. Yes. Oh, sorry, I can hear you. Yes, yes. Yeah.
Good. Go ahead.
Right, yeah, I do think we've got it right. I think we've got this absolutely right, because mending our relationship with Europe is a fairly long-term project. It's more of a 5 to 10 year project than a 1 or 2 year project. But we do have to start straight away. And there are some low-hanging fruits, some easy wins. We want to see the government take a much more positive approach on student and young persons' mobility. I can't see why we don't go back into Erasmus. We definitely need to sort out the sanitary phytosanitary agreement so that agricultural products can cross the borders easily. But this is an incremental approach, and over a period of years, we can get to a point where the rejoin issue, we can't rejoin until there's a completely settled opinion across Britain that is the right thing to do. And it doesn't have to be only
all right,
in Britain,
Phil, you
of course.
say you talk about... No, well, let me interrupt you, because you were talking about low-hanging fruit. But what makes you think there is a general feeling across the UK for a more liberal immigration policy when it comes to the sort of youth mobility scheme that you're outlining?
No, Erasmus isn't an immigration policy. It's a student exchange. Our universities used to make a huge amount of money out of this project, because we did a lot better than our European universities, because we have so many excellent universities in Britain. In my area, Warwick University was absolutely replete with Erasmus students every year. So our university sector is losing revenue. Having this sort of exchange is the sort of exchange which is temporary, and it gives experience. It gives British students the experience of working and studying in Europe, and it gives European students the experience of studying and working in British universities, and it's a win-win.
All right. Phil Benyon, on that positive note, I'll let you go. Let's welcome Katie Balls from The Spectator. Hello, Katie. On this issue of the EU, I was speaking to a delegate earlier, a younger delegate who wants the party, the Liberal Democrats, to go further, be bolder on possibly rejoining the single market within the short term rather than the medium term. Don't hear much about that here at the conference.
No, and I think when you speak to various Lib Dem staffers who've been, through the years on this, they're still a little bit mentally scarred by what happened under Jo Swinson and the revoke Article 50 plan, which of course led to a pretty disastrous election result for the party. And I think therefore it's clear the appetite amongst the membership, the Lib Dem grassroots. We've always known that, pretty pro-EU in recent years particularly. But I think Ed Davey wants to be cautious because he doesn't want his party to become all about Brexit. Yet, this is actually a democratic party where the members do get a say. So it's a constant, I think, positioning of how much do you listen and then looking ahead so you don't get bounced into positions. Obviously, Keir Starmer has already said he wants a closer relationship with the EU, but seems to have some really big red lines that make that quite impossible. But it does give Ed Davey some space, probably, to jump on a slight change in mood if he wants to go further.
Right, and there are these red lines, because I think the EU reportedly would like the Labour government to go a little bit further, but they're not giving way at the moment on issues like a youth mobility scheme, for example. Is there pressure, a lot of pressure from members here within the party?
Well, I think that there were people who were discontented during the Lib Dems election campaign, that there wasn't more emphasis on the rejoin policy. And that turned out to be a terrible mistake on their part, because not talking about it worked really well for Ed Davey. So I actually think that the very, very rampantly pro-EU rejoin parts of the Lib Dems have been a bit chastened by calling the general election campaign wrong, genuinely. I think, in the longer term, clearly, the Lib Dems do see themselves, as Chris said, with the SNP, as the pro-European kind of ginger group in British politics. And that is an important role for them because this new government does seem to be very cautious across the piece. And so there is a sort of political space for calls to be bolder, particularly on those red lines. I mean, the youth mobility scheme, as Munira said, it's not really an immigration policy, and it's something that the Germans desperately want. So we could probably ask, as Britain, for something in our own interests and do a deal. Why not do that deal? So I think the Lib Dems will try and keep up that pressure. I think the sort of awkward squad in the Lib Dems are much quieter this year than they've been before. I mean, those blue, I know, but those blue berets with the European stars stitched to them, I haven't seen any of them this year. So that's probably positive, I would say.
Right, but is this going to be a focus, a priority at all for the Liberal Democrats in the next year?
Well, the fact that we've already been pushing the Labour government on the youth mobility scheme and Erasmus already suggests to you that we retain our strong pro-European credentials, and we're calling for things that will actually benefit our young people.
But that's quite specific,
yeah.
And
but that's
as Phil Benyon just said, that's low-hanging fruit. Yeah. In terms of renegotiating, or at least talking about an improved trade deal, as Liberal Democrats and the Labour government would say, there's no sign of that.
But Jo, we've got to start somewhere. You start by making that relationship closer, and these are the first steps. And Keir Starmer said he wants to rebuild the relationship and renegotiate the trade deal. But when he's being offered these things, he's not even accepting those. So I'm not quite clear where he's going to go with it, and we're comfortable pushing him on that.
The EU itself, particularly Germany and France, are not exactly in rude health themselves, politically or economically. So maybe it's the right strategy to hold back here for the Liberal Democrats.
I mean, potentially. I think in terms of Liberal Democrat voters, they're not looking at Schultz's poll ratings and how their economy is going. I've completely changed my views on Brexit. And also, I think it's quite a cultural thing, this idea of being closer. So I think there is an opportunity. I think Keir Starmer clearly is scared about doing this because of the Leave voters that they think they won the election on. And, you know, Lib Dems do also have some Leave voters in there. But I think, you know, the Lib Dem position seems to be about getting to the single market. So if there is the position, it's a little bit, well, in which case speak about the position, the freedom of movement that would come with that and so forth. And it feels it's a bit quiet if that is the position, which is a strange thing, I think, because the position actually...
yesterday talking about the single market when he was questioned on
But you're
the
not
Today
shouting
programme.
about it, are you?
But we're shouting about voters' priorities. If I go and knock on a door and I'm in a pro-Remain constituency and all the doors I've knocked on in the last 2 years, nobody's brought up Brexit with me. But what if Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are serious about growing the economy? This is an issue they are going to have to tackle. Can I just give you one very quick example? I went to visit a young and growing British cargo airline based in my constituency, and they said, look, we don't want to go there with all the Brexit arguments, but the complete lack of alignment on regulation and qualifications in the aviation industry is costing us hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds a year and loads of red tape. That's the sort of thing that is low-hanging fruit that can be tackled quickly.
I just think that for the Lib Dems, it's really important the tone of voice in which they talk to the electorate about Europe, because for a while there it was almost insulting Leave voters actually and playing into a kind of culture war aspect of the Brexit divide in this country. They must never go back there, in my view. So all of these practical steps that help businesses and help employers, great. Don't patronise the electorate.
Because the cost gets passed
you
on
don't
to
hang
all
on.
of us.
You don't hang on to seats in Cornwall if you insult Leave voters, for example. So I think it's really good to have got away from that.
Well, let's talk about another subject that is a sore for the Liberal Democrats. This BBC News headline, I should say. Tuition fees must go up, unis say, as term begins. Now, of course, when it comes to trust, the Liberal Democrats under Nick Clegg were the party that betrayed their voters over failing to scrap tuition fees for all the reasons that we know, and you entered into that coalition. Now universities say there is a massive financial crisis. Should fees go up?
Well, Liberal Democrats have been saying for a long time, actually, what we need to do if we want to get more disadvantaged people into university is look at reinstating maintenance grants. So if the Labour government's going to start looking at putting tuition fees up, if they do nothing on maintenance grants, I think it would be very difficult for us to support such a policy.
But if they did, you would support tuition fees going up by inflation?
Until we see the details, it's hard for me to comment. But
you are the education spokesperson.
I recognise as education spokesperson, university finances are in a dire state.
So what would you do?
Well, for a start, we'd undo what the Tories did around international students, which has plummeted international student numbers for some postgraduate degrees, because that is a really important source of income, as well as
we haven't got much time. But would you keep
power.
tuition fees at their height of £9,250, or would you look at them going up?
Well, unless there's something on maintenance grants, I wouldn't support it going up.
You wouldn't. How else would you fund them then?
Well, as I say, we need to look at international students. But in the long term, we've said we need a whole review of higher education finance because it's not working. And we know there's also quite a lot of waste in the sector, and so a lot of productivity that needs to be driven out.
Katie?
I think it's just unpalatable choices, because either it's potentially a bailout, which Reece doesn't have much money going around, as she tells us regularly, is that we're going to put it. Potentially it's tuition fees going up, which I think Labour would have a voter problem with if they did do it, particularly these younger voters. Or potentially you are relaxing the number of international students, which we know Keir Starmer's quite wary about. If he doesn't want to go near youth mobility, I think there's a similar factor around suddenly, having a rush of international students and relaxing those, and how that could be weaponised by the other parties. So I think it is a real tight spot, really, in terms of what Labour can do on it.
I mean, this could be a crisis shortly, because an institution might get to...
Yeah, it's a crisis already. There's under 10, but a quite significant number of universities are on the edge of going bust. We know that. And their finances don't add up anymore. And the government doesn't have the answer. And I don't think
And
any
Liberal Democrats,
party has
could they
the
look
answer
at putting
yet.
up tuition fees or backing that sort of policy if maintenance grants were looked at?
Well, maintenance grants should be introduced. That's very important for access and for social justice and social mobility. That any party with any influence should be asking for that.
We've run out of time for this programme, but don't worry because we've got a second programme. So go and get a quick lunch or a sandwich because I'll be back with more guests covering Ed Davies' speech that is starting at 2:30, but we'll be back on air at 2:15 and we will stay on air until 3:45. So please join me on this lovely sunny day and watch the Liberal Democrat conference speech. But thank you to all of my guests for joining me now. Have a very good afternoon, and from all of us here, bye-bye.